Welcome to my review of another game that I have no idea how to pronounce. And this was for the Switch. This was a downloadable game that I got pretty cheap. Though I will say it wasn't worth the cheap price for me. I found the game to be pretty sloppy. I did like the idea of it, obviously. I really like the old Kung Fu games. So this is really heavily based upon that, and it has a little bit of China Warrior and some other games in that style. It seems to have some influence from them, but it does kind of have its own, unique style to it. I think if they would have tightened up the hit detection, it would have been a lot better. And of course, it would have been a lot longer. But I mean, the old Kung Fu, it was a short game, but it's also a product of the time, But I could have forgiven the short length. It was just, the main issue I have, I don't really have a problem when a game is short, but I just found the hit detection to really lack, you know what I mean? A lot of times I would see my hits go through the enemies and I would get hit. And it can get really irritating later on, even with the regular stages. They can get quite dense, and it's irritating when your hits don't really connect like you think they should. So that was one of my biggest issues with the game. Aside from that, there's not really, a huge enemy variety, which, it could be forgiven because the old Kung Fu didn't have many enemies either. So if it was as good as that game, then that would have still been good, but it just doesn't hit that level for me because the gameplay just doesn't feel as tight. Now that could just be me, but even when I fought the bosses, I felt like the boss fights were kind of like just trading hits, and I felt like I had to figure out how to exploit the bosses more than actually fight them. I always felt like there was some kind of cheap trick that I wasn't aware of. So I felt like it was one of those kind of games where I had to find the exploits. And I break down all the strats that I used in my tutorial, which has commentary, and it explains everything I used to exploit the bosses and all that. So of course it is very playable and beatable. And I only review games that I complete, so I would not, even review this if I didn't finish it. But in the options menu, you have some difficulty settings, and you can set the lives up to 7, which is kind of a weird thing because it doesn't make a difference in any way, unless you're trying to do a 1cc run. But aside from that, there's no checkpoints in the stages. The way the game works is you have unlimited continues, so you can continue as much as you want. But each stage, you have to beat each stage in a single run, just like the original Kung Fu. There's no checkpoints in the actual stages. But whenever you get to a boss, you get your next checkpoint. So if you want to consider that a checkpoint within the stage, you could call that the checkpoint. It's pretty much like you have to go through the whole stage, and then when you get to the boss, that's your next checkpoint. So it locks it in. And then if you lose lives, you just start at the boss. So it's forgiving in that sense. But, I found myself constantly wrestling with the hit detection, which really took the enjoyment down for me. And some of the bosses, this is a very simple boss, but it's in contrast to other bosses that felt kind of spastic, and I wasn't really sure what you were really supposed to do with them. It could be that I just didn't put enough time into the game, but, I have completed, many of the Kung Fu games and ports of them, and, very similar games, and, the ones that were good actually played well, and I felt like this just played sloppy to me, And that could just be a personal preference thing. Because I didn't spend a ton of time with the game, just enough time to beat it. You see the enemy variety hasn't switched much, and this is the semifinal stage. Or this might actually be the final stage. I think this is the final stage. Not completely sure, but you can see the enemy variety is about the same. You get a few extra enemies here and there, but it does get pretty damn dense, which I like. I do like that, but I felt a lot of times that my hits would go through the enemies. Especially these little midget characters that constantly run back and forth into you. A lot of times it just felt like my hits would just go through them and they would just damage me. And it's possible maybe I was just playing the game badly, but I felt like the game started to feel kind of sloppy after a while. It wasn't one I wanted to play through on a harder setting, because I just felt like it was just irritating me with inconsistencies. And then you can perform bullshit like this, you know what I mean? You just stand in one place and sweep the boss. You could do shit like that in the original Kung Fu, but they haven't really added anything to the formula. I mean, that was a really old fucking game. And at the time it was great, and I still enjoy it. But, the game did have a lot of limitations. And this is, I consider this to be a lot worse than the original Kung Fu, which is not, it is kind of a classic for the time, but it's not really, I wouldn't consider it a great game because it doesn't have a lot to offer. But it's still a fun game to run through. But this, they just throw in more shit everywhere, and worse hit detection as far as I felt. I felt that it was more imprecise. But maybe that's just me. You also have a special move where you can throw out a dragon, which is good to save up for harder enemies that take more hits, and bosses. You charge it up, I believe, by striking the enemies. So now I'm trying to see if this is the... I'm not sure if this was the final boss gauntlet, but we'll see in a minute. I think this might be the final gauntlet of bosses. Luckily, they do give you a checkpoint on each form of the final boss, which there's a lot. Actually, no, I guess that was the semifinal stage, because the final stage has... the final stage has like a bunch of bosses you have to fight. So we're probably going to see the final stage next. I showed some stages in full for the review, some of the harder ones. So, actually no, maybe this might be. I guess after stage 6, maybe the final stage is just all bosses. Because it says stage 6 clear, but then you got a bunch of bosses. See, this guy, I found you can just do this. He'll block your kicks, but while you're doing this, you're charging up your power bar. It takes a while, but once my power bar is full, I can throw a single move at him and destroy him. So I show a lot of exploits like that. I'm always finding exploits for these kind of games. But, just because I was able to exploit all the bosses doesn't mean I enjoyed the game that much. So that was, I felt like it could have played a lot better. But it is pretty easy to exploit with some positioning tricks that I found. Luckily, you do get a checkpoint at each form of the boss. You don't have to start the whole boss gauntlet over. So once you beat a form, you will get a checkpoint. I wouldn't really recommend the game even for the cheap price because I found it irritating, but if you like what you see, maybe give it a try since it was a cheap game. But for me, I just found it to be pretty irritating. I didn't feel like it played great. But maybe I just never got into the groove with the game, Because when you watch the gameplay, it looks like it plays pretty tight, but when I was playing it, it just felt kind of inconsistent to me. But the game didn't take me too long to beat. Let me see. I'll check right now and see how long the game took me to beat. But it was, I know it was a short game for me. It was very short-lived. So let's see. We're at around 1 hour and 29 minutes to beat the game, so it really didn't last long. And unless you're going to play it a second time, or if you find the first time, extremely difficult, you could take longer, but it probably won't be the most enjoyable time. For me, I give the game a 5.5 out of 10. I think it's just above mediocre, but not enough for me to call it a decent game, which would be like a 6 for me. So I think it's just above mediocre. I think, the game... It's almost decent, but it just kind of irritates me more than I enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.